Welcome to Art Up Close. Happy Wednesday, and welcome to our final episode of the spring semester series of Art Up Close at the BCMA.
Yeah, our final episode. I'm Claire. I'm a senior and I'm majoring in art history and minoring in economics. And it's been a real bright spot of my year to be working on this series with Lucy and Elizabeth this semester.
Yes, it's been a really rewarding experience, and I will miss Claire next year because I am a junior. So I'm double majoring here at Bowdoin in art history and government, and I'm also a student representative with Claire to the Museum Advisory Council.
Great. Okay, so for those who are new to the Art Up Close webinar series, our aim is to connect students with pieces of work in the Bowdoin Museum. Each episode features a bite-sized presentation led by a Bowdoin student, a museum staff member, or an art history professor. We really hope you learn some new things today. Sabrina will be presenting on her honors project, which is such an impressive accomplishment. And we really encourage you to check out our previous episodes of Art Up Close. They are all posted on Bowdoin's YouTube channel, and we will drop that link in the chat now.
Yes, so as Claire said, today we're excited to welcome Sabrina Lin to present on her honors project titled Sight, Power, and Experience, Contemporary Installation Art and Global Mobility. So Sabrina Lin is a senior here at Bowdoin, pursuing a double major in art history and Italian studies. Sabrina is also a minor in visual arts. Her research interests span diverse topics in these fields, from medieval love poetry, Italian Renaissance painting, to global contemporary art. She's most interested in investigating the connections between art, culture, and geopolitics, employing the intersectional lenses of gender, race, class, and nationality. And in her honors project advised by Professor Pamela Fletcher, she reflects on her long-term questioning of the meaning, potentials, and contradictions of movement in the contemporary art world. So in addition to her academic research, Sabrina is also passionate about museum work and has previously held positions at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, the OCT Contemporary Art Terminal, the Hillstead Museum, and among others. So most recently, Sabrina co-curated the exhibition Creeping Pavement, Depictions of Urbanizing America at the BCMA with the Student Museum Collective. And Sabrina also serves as the co-editor-in-chief of the Bowdoin Journal of Art and managing editor of the Bowdoin Orient. And in her spare time, Sabrina enjoys painting, cooking, traveling, and learning new languages. And I've heard throughout the semester, Sabrina working on her honors thesis and working on this project in different meetings. And I'm very proud of you that it's done, and congratulations.
Absolutely. We are thrilled Sabrina can share her honors project with us today. We encourage you as our virtual audience to engage with her, ask any questions you can think of. After her presentation, Lucy and I will moderate questions that you type in to the Q&A section. And closed captioning is available on the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. So with that, Sabrina, we will let you take it away and share your screen.
Thank you, Claire and Lucy, for that warm welcome and for that lovely introduction. And thank you also to the BCMA for inviting me to speak for the Art Up Close series. Today, the title of my presentation will be Sight, Power, and Experience, Contemporary Installation Art and Global Mobility. This presentation is drawn in large from my honors project with Professor Pamela Fletcher in the Art History Department. I would like to thank Professor Fletcher for encouraging me and working with me to explore the intersections between space, movement, and migration. I also need to thank Professor Peggy Wong, whose mentorship has been instrumental to my research. And lastly, I owe my thanks to the entire staff at the BCMA because the project was actually inspired by my summer internship at the museum in 2019. So with that, I'm just gonna start my presentation and note that this is a very abbreviated version compared to the final product of my honors thesis. So I'll be sharing a little bit with you some of my processes and framework, but this will by no means be the full extent of my presentation and research. And I encourage you to ask more questions and reach out to me if you were interested in learning about the project in more detail. So first, I would like to begin by touching on some of the context between art and globalization and what it really means when we talk about global art, or the global term in contemporary art. Many discussions on the intersections between art and globalization begin their chronology around the year 1989. As we know, the fall of the Berlin Wall, collapse of the Eastern Bloc, end of the Cold War, uprisings on the Tiananmen Square in China, the rising tides of apartheid in South Africa. There is a sense of an emerging new world order and the disruption of a stable Western hegemony. In the art world, these events coincided with Jean-Hubert Matin's exhibition, Musiciens de la Terre, at the Centre Pompidou in 1989, which was the first ambitious but ultimately flawed attempt at creating an exhibition of contemporary art with a truly global outlook. The exhibition featured 100 artists divided by half into so-called centers of the art world, such as the United States and Western Europe, and 50 other artists from the peripheries, such as Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Australia. The show was an ambitious attempt, but ultimately was flawed because it arbitrarily selected artworks that represented marginalized art and constricting cultures within nation-state borders and boundaries. At the same time, 1989 was notably also the year that President George H.W. Bush embarked on a presidency centered on foreign policy and military operations worldwide. 12 years later, his son, George W. Bush, launched the American War on Terror following the events of 9/11, which again had lasting reverberations on issues of immigration, international human rights, and political anxieties on both individual and national fronts. Concurrently, Nigerian curator Okwai Enwezor's exhibition Documenta 11, which was realized between 2001 and 2002, spanned 5 platforms and 4 continents and placed issues of globalism, art, and politics into question through a constellation of traveling exhibitions. Documenta especially was fighting to abolish the divisions between Western and non-Western art, showing artists from 45 countries and transforming the format into a decentered transnational endeavor. So within the rise of geopolitical tensions and the reshaping of political orders, there was a strong sense of reshaping and readapting the missions of contemporary art institutions. And I noticed that there was a strong preoccupation with movement and mobility, namely what it means to move under constraints of contested boundaries, how artists and artworks migrate within the nexus of power and capital, as well as how the individual and collective experiences of art can change based on geography and spectatorship. So with those ideas in mind, I began by looking into 3 case studies of contemporary artists who came into fruition, or sorry, came into maturity really under the backdrop of the geopolitical kind of tensions and also the art world reshaping itself in the late 1980s to the turn of the century. And they were Yanagi Yukinori, Alfredo Jaar, and Doris Salcedo, who began exploring the theme of transnational movement to express the tensions and tribulations of an emerging globalism. Their careers coincided with the global biennial boom, which began also in the late 1990s, which saw curators and creatives from peripheries asserting their place in the formerly predominantly Eurocentric contemporary art scene. I discussed these artists who were born again in the late 1950s and have been active in the international art sphere since the late 80s. For example, Yanagi Yukinori moved to the US from Japan in the late 1980s to pursue his degree at Yale. Alfredo Jaar similarly moved to the US in 1982 after fleeing the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile. Doris Salcedo traveled frequently to the States in the 1980s and completed her MA from NYU in 1984. So I argue that these 3 artists use the affordances of the global arts system to expose the limitations of global mobility, which again constitutes larger injustices and inequalities faced by social, political, and racial minorities. At a moment when the free flow of capital and viewers to global art fairs and markets exists in sharp counterpoint to the patrolled and constricted movements of migrants and refugees, their works use the vocabulary of the former to reveal the fantasy of an open cosmopolitan global village. Yanagi, Salcedo, and Jaar's positions as not only established artists, but also expats and immigrants with personal histories of displacement allow them to use their location in the global system to comment on the system's inherent inequalities and limitations. So that is kind of a larger overview of my project. And now I'm going to discuss one of the examples in more detail to illustrate some of the points and some of the frameworks I'm using to analyze these works. So today I will largely focus on one example, which is this work, Shivolith by Doris Salcedo, which was commissioned for the Tate Modern's Unilever series in London in 2007. In which the artist split open the turbine hall ground with a 548 feet long fracture in the cement. So I'm approaching this work from multiple lenses and themes in which I analyze the work's relationship to time and temporality, the work's relationship to history, the use of institutional critique, as well as lastly, the use of symbols, language, and codes. So first off, just to kind of give you a sense of what this work is about, Doris Salcedo again created this fracture in the ground in which she really encouraged time-specific and prolonged viewing interactions in this work. She embedded fencing and hand-carved surfaces within the crevices of the crack to draw viewers' eyes downwards into the fractured ground. The crack began at one end of the Tate Martin's Turbine Hall entrance and starts as a hairline crack that that slowly widens, bifurcates, and deepens until eventually splintering the entire floor open. As viewers bend, kneel, and pour over the crack, sometimes even sticking their head inside, time becomes crucial for sustaining attention and provoking a physical relationship to the shattered surface. For example, one visitor to the Shivolith wrote in their blog that you move slowly because you're looking down as you walk. Maybe sometimes you'll need to sit or lie down on the crack itself. The crevices interiors are again filled with mesh links and cement, which were actually cast after a rock face and sculpted by hand using dental tools, further drawing attention down into the materiality of its creation. For the viewers, the act of carefully following and tracing along the Shivolith from one end of the passageway to the destination is likened to a procession, a particular type of movement that is carried out and performed and sustained by time. The work therefore shifts from plainly visible to hidden from sight and obscured by the Turbine Hall's eastern glass walls, thereby requiring these visitors to commit the time it takes to walk its whole length in order to gain full access to its meaning. What was also really interesting about this work was that it continues to exist in the temporal framework even after the exhibition's conclusion. So for example, Shivolith invites consideration of time as a marker of memorial and memory. The crack of the insulation was filled in by the Tate after its conclusion, but intentionally leaving behind a visible scar and gnarly wound across the Turbine Hall's surface. Speaking to an enduring experience of pain and trauma, Shivolith, after its completion, asserts its place in time as refusing to be neglected or forgotten. The Turbine Hall remains a highly trafficked space for international visitors, artists, and artworks. Large groups of people will continue to step on and walk over the sutured wound of the Shivolith, therefore showcasing another kind of sustained movement on the site of an ephemeral work of art. Those who recognize and reflect on the presence of the folding crack engage in a dialogue with the passage of time and the resounding legacy of Salcedo's work. Shivolith is therefore able to continuously situate any moving body within its narrative of movement, where future generations operate on top of ruins of anonymous disembodied voices. The installation continues to exert its impact as a process of unending fracture, and therefore becomes an irreversible identifier for a still very much relevant and ongoing process. This palimpsest existence of Salcedo's shattered ground serves as a cautionary signal for future visitors in the space, in reminding them that movement is in fact neither stable nor without consequences. Next, I'd like to quickly touch on the use of institutional history and critique in Salcedo's work in her choosing of the crack at Tate Modern. So installation art is inherently embedded with a layer of criticality because installation art likes to deconstruct and decode the frameworks around itself. So for example, those being critiqued encompass the studio, the art market, the gallery, art critics, and art history. Art historian Mi-Wang Kwang argues that installation works reveal the ways in which institutions mold art's meaning to modulate its cultural and economic value, as well as to make apparent their imbricated relationship to the broader social, economic, and political process of the day. So for Salcedo, when she proposed the project to the Tate, she made explicit references to institutional history, recognizing the Turbine Hall as an inherently privileged institutional space, which she aims to split open and unearth. In her proposal, she says that her work will address the whole, which is both the whole with a W and without, in history that marks the bottomless difference that separates whites from non-whites. Shivolith is an attempt to address the section of humankind that has been left out of the history of modernity and kept at the margin of high Western culture. So in her proposal, she is effectively calling out the Tate as well as the capitalist society's culpability in creating earth-shattering divisions However, economics also come into play when museums embrace and invite criticality of contemporary art. For example, the director of the Tate at the time shyly characterizes the museum's own position as to look forward to the future, we need to face the past. The chief executive of Unilever, the multinational conglomerate that sponsored the project, commended the artist on her ability to see the world differently, but also co-opting her message into a corporate vision to make people feel good, look good, and get more out of life. This kind of feel-good statement indeed rings ironically contradictory to Salcedo's own insistence on absolute indifference. She claims that no cultural ornament attenuates the dissolution and destitution it is addressing. So the disparity in tone between the three statements therefore highlights the tensions of site and institutional critique. There is a radical difference in terms of juggling the institution, the commissioning body, and the funding agency. At the same time, Shivolith is effectively carving out and calling attention to the negative space, namely to whom and what the space is accessible and what is not present or not seen. One wonders, for example, who has access to this space and what movement is deemed accessible and acceptable in this kinds of space. Furthermore, the labor-intensive and handcrafted quality makes it apparent that the man-made nature of Shivolith's schism is something that has been deliberately put into place and constructed by force. It is indeed a subtle but by no means simple double entendre on the making of spaces and their inherent modes of exclusion. And I'd also just like to quickly note that the position of the Tate occupy a central position in the canon, really, of Western sanctioned modernism in art history. So therefore, Salcedo is also kind of exposing the fantasy of post-war modernizing London itself. For example, the museum was formerly built as a bankside power station until it was converted into the museum in the year 2000. The former power station was built in 1947 during the time when the British decolonization introduced massive labor migration flows from former colonies into London, which created really the multicultural and multiracial metropolis that represents London today. Nowadays, the Tate Modern is located on the brink of two ends of London society, poised between the wealthy elite north side of the Thames and the lesser south side that was historically home to many low-income and immigrant communities. So in this way, the Shivolith represents a kind of historical geographical shift with which the audience is encouraged to reckon with and reflect on their own place in the history of privileged erasure, especially present in the increasing gentrification of the area brought by the museum and its incoming visitors. So lastly, I'd like to address the issues of language and symbols and codes that is also present in this work. So as you may know, the word Shivolith comes from the biblical story in which there was a tribe of Ephraimites who were slain on their passage across the river Jordan as a result of being labeled the other for not being able to pronounce the word Shivolith. And this term Shivolith has continued to being reimagined across cultures and used as identification systems or tests to note semiotics or boundary maintenance and surveillance. However, for Salcedo, there is a very specific reference that is rooted in the poetry works of Paul Celan. So for this work, she's drawing on the poetry work of a Holocaust survivor and a Jewish author who wrote exclusively in German. However, because the work is now translated into English, much of the original context and nuances are lost. This kind of poignancy becomes further more important as the works are transplanted from the artist's personal context into the Anglo-American linguistic and cultural sphere of spectatorship. While the participants all share and inhabit and move within the same space, one's understanding and perception of movement is largely defined by their ability, or rather lack thereof, to comprehend the entirety of work's meaning. So I realize we're running a little bit tight on time, so I'm just going to quickly jump to the concluding parts of my study. So again, as I tried to briefly illustrate, mobility in its basic sense as the ability of quality of being mobile, of moving, can sometimes seem like a neutral term. As the examples we just saw have shown us, one person's mobility or one person's freedom to move in certain spaces is always associated with temporal limitation, historical formations of power, as well as issues of relative access and meaning and understanding by associating with distinct communities and racial groups. So therefore, I don't think it's a coincidence that in our modern vernacular, mobility is most commonly paired with phrases like social mobility or economic mobility. The implications of power and privilege are therefore inescapable in constructing how people move physically or within a society. More than anything, this research and writing has coincided almost perfectly with the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. So while the majority of the world is still stuck in lockdown, people are separated from loved ones and families, and immigration processes halted and border controls more stringent than ever. We now have a much more sobering outlook on what it means to move and how it feels when that freedom has been taken away. So I feel like it's hard to evaluate an individual work's capacity to change people or society. However, if anything, these works raise awareness on critical issues that will continue to be relevant for the foreseeable future. So thank you for listening to my presentation. And now I'm gonna close out of my share screen and turn back to Claire and Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That was phenomenal. I have so many questions I just want to ask you, and I just want to learn more. But we can start with one of our first questions in the chat from Frank Goodyear. So the question is, can you share some thoughts about the popular and critical reception of Salcedo's installation? What dialogues did it generate? I'm not sure if I pronounced that name right, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Frank. That's a really interesting point because there was actually quite a little bit of controversy with Salcedo's work, because when the work was first introduced to the British public, Salcedo was really, I think, uncomfortable, or she was a little bit disappointed in the public's kind of obsession with the physical creation of the work. By that, I mean the people were more interested in how the crack was created, what kind of were the physical mechanisms behind its creation, as opposed to the symbolic and I think racial and historical meanings that Salcedo was trying to represent with their crack. So there's kind of a difference in terms of the artist's intentionality and then the popular reception by the public. As for the sort of more critical and scholarly reception of the installation, I noted that in my work, in my research, I've discovered that most of the scholarship around this work has really focused on a more monographic approach by linking it to Salcedo's other bodies of work or by linking it to Salcedo's personal biography. So the dialogues it generated still much largely, I think, revolves around the artist's personal identity or the larger trajectory of her career, as opposed to opening it up to other works of installation art, which is what I'm trying to do in my research. So there's definitely a lot to unpack because the work has taken on such a cultural significance for art history and for contemporary culture, but I definitely think there's still a lot to be said and a lot to be discovered.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing. Another question we have, just curious to hear more about your process. How did you choose these 3 artists, and what was that process of choosing these case studies?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. I started looking into the topic roughly last summer when I realized that I had interest into discovering what space and movement really means in contemporary art. So I started kind of collecting a list of works that caught my attention by flipping through catalogs, going to websites, looking at exhibition reviews, and I actually had a massive spreadsheet that included all the possible choices and works. And I started playing with comparisons and groupings of different works and see what putting works together would generate in terms of their shared similarities or differences. And I eventually ended up picking these 3 works because they share a lot of backgrounds, or they share a lot of commonalities in the artist's personal backgrounds and their identities. And also they share a lot of formal similarities. For example, their use of time, their relationship to sites, as well as their use of languages and poetries. So it's definitely not the only case study that could highlight this issue, but for me, it was actually more of a curatorial process in thinking about what putting different works together could juxtapose and represent and highlight in terms of how people understand the theme. So I'm definitely very interested in expanding my possible selection of works and maybe thinking more about this as a long-term project that could open up more comparisons.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your presentation today. Just for showing, I'm a junior, showing what an honors project looks like, and showing also just a really cool piece of art that I wouldn't necessarily have gotten to hear about otherwise. So with that, just because I think we are going to try to be wrapped up by 1:30. Any questions you have for Sabrina, feel free to reach out to her directly, or we can also help you get in touch with her. But with that, we know it's hard to believe, but this is our last Art Up Close episode of the semester. And we've had such a great time launching this program, watching it grow over these past 2 semesters. And we would like to thank Anne and Frank Goodyear for all of their support. And of course, Elizabeth Humphrey for her mentorship and dedication to the series, for making this possible after just getting an email from Claire and me about how we were interested in this. So thank you all. And thank you to Marty Janeway for helping us promote the series and getting each episode on students' radar. That was also really helpful.
Absolutely. I echo all of the same things that Lucy just shared, and thank you, Sabrina. We're really excited about this program, and we're not exactly sure what next year will look like, if we'll keep doing virtual program, or I won't be a part of this, but Lucy will be spearheading, or if the series will shift to more in person. So your feedback is very valuable. We can share some emails in the chat, but feel free to reach out if you have any suggestions. And we just want to extend our thanks again. We've had a really dedicated group of people who have shown up consistently to support us with these episodes. So thank you so much. Again, this has just been such a fun passion project for Lucy and I, and it's been really wonderful to connect with the museum in this really virtual year. So thank you, everyone. We hope you have a great rest of the year and summer, and please do be in touch with any feedback.
Thank you. Bye-bye.